My name is Fiona Fletcher. I was 30 years old the morning my father and brother walked into an intensive care unit and tried to steal a 400-acre farm while my grandfather's chest was still rising and falling on a ventilator. They claimed he had signed off on the sale before his stroke. I stayed quiet. I let them plan their payday. What they did not know was that a few days later, my grandfather would wake up, ask for his lawyer, and pull a secret deed from the lining of his pillowcase. Then the real owner of the land walked in, and my father dropped his coffee cup as the bailiff called the courtroom to rise. Welcome back to Fluffy Revenge, where quiet women build airtight cases and greedy families write their own eviction notices. If you know what it feels like to be the daughter who handles the hard things while everyone else takes the credit, let me know your age in the comments and subscribe. You will want to stick around for this one to understand how a family reaches the point of liquidating a legacy. While the patriarch is still breathing, you have to understand Iowa. Out Here land is not just an asset. It is your bloodline. My grandfather, Silas Fletcher, spent his entire life working soil that his own grandfather broke with a horse-drawn plow. At 78 years old, his hands were mapped with scars from frostbite barbed wire and endless harvests. I grew up riding in the cab of his combine, learning to evaluate soil drainage and yield estimates. That education turned into my career as an agricultural appraiser. I calculate what dirt is worth on paper. Silas taught me what it is worth in sweat. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator measured the time in the hospital room. Silas had suffered a severe cerebral hemorrhage in the north pasture 2 days prior. The doctors put him in an induced coma to reduce brain swelling. I sat beside the mattress, tracing the rough knuckles of his right hand, listening to the machines keep him tethered to the earth. The heavy door swung inward, breaking the clinical silence. My father, Richard, stepped into the room, followed closely by my older brother, Trent. They wore pressed denim and spotless leather boots, the pristine uniform of men who liked the aesthetic of rural life but avoided the actual labor. They did not walk to the bed. They did not ask the attending nurse about the latest scans or the prognosis. Richard stopped at the foot of the mattress. His eyes flicked over the life support equipment before landing on me. "Do you have his keys?" he asked. I looked up from the pale skin of Silas's hand. "Hello, Dad." "The keys to the farmhouse, Fiona," Trent added from the corner, his thumbs moving across his smartphone. "We need the combination to the floor safe in the study to get his affairs in order." I felt the weight of the brass keyring resting deep inside my coat pocket. My grandfather was fighting a war inside his own skull, and his son was treating him like an unlocked vault. "No," I said, a single flat word. Richard shifted his weight. He despised being denied, but he recovered smooth and fast, deploying a tactic I had endured since childhood. His expression shifted into patronizing warmth. "Fiona, listen to me." His voice dropped to a low, pacifying hum. "You are the strong one. You have always been the capable one in this family. The doctors need someone detail-oriented here to handle the medical proxy decisions. You manage the hospital. Trent and I will take the burden of the business off your plate." The business. 4 generations of Fletcher history. Pristine acreage, towering silos, and a farmhouse built by hands that were currently resting motionless on crisp white sheets. "We just need to secure the documents," Trent said, never looking up from his screen. It is practical. The nervous energy vibrating off my brother told a different story. Grieving men do not rush. Men desperate for a payday check their watches. They were operating on a timeline they wanted to keep me blind to, eager to sift through the remains before the heart monitor flatlined. I nodded slowly, letting the quiet stretch until they both shifted uncomfortably on the linoleum tiles. "I will handle the doctors," I said, keeping my tone empty of inflection. Richard let out a sharp puff of breath. He patted my shoulder, a hollow gesture, and signaled Trent towards the hall. The door clicked shut, returning the room to the mechanical hiss of the ventilator. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small leather notebook, the one I typically use to log crop rotations. I uncapped a black gel pen. Tuesday, 2:14 p.m. I wrote in steady, precise print. Richard and Trent requested access to the floor safe. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. My grandfather was asleep, but I was wide awake, and I was going to document every single step they took across our land. 3 days blurred into a quiet marathon of sterile corridors, paper cups of bitter coffee, and the rhythmic mechanical breathing of the ventilator. The intensive care unit existed in a permanent twilight where time felt suspended. I sat by my grandfather hour after hour, reading him the local agricultural reports, hoping the familiar cadences of soybean yields and rainfall averages might find their way through the dark curtain of his coma. Richard and Trent did not return to the room. They texted their inquiries to my phone, asking for updates on his vital signs with the detached tone of men tracking a delayed flight. On Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Richard demanding a family meeting in the hospital cafeteria. I left Silas in the care of a trusted daytime nurse and took the elevator down to the ground floor. The cafeteria smelled of industrial floor cleaner and burnt toast. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, irritating hum. I spotted them sitting in a corner booth. Richard wore a tailored charcoal blazer, and Trent sported a branded golf shirt. They looked pristine, polished, and entirely out of place in a room filled with exhausted families and scrub-clad doctors. I slid into the vinyl booth across from them, placing my hands on the sticky laminate table. Richard did not offer comfort. He did not ask how I was holding up. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, sliding it across the table toward me. The heritage of our family rested inside that folder. For 4 generations, Fletcher blood had watered the soil of that farm. Silas spent 40 years ensuring the pH balance of the earth was perfect, rotating crops to protect the nutrients and defending the property line against creeping suburban sprawl. Richard, on the other hand, spent his youth running from the dirt. He moved to the city, launched a series of failed business ventures, and always treated the farm as a primitive embarrassment. Silas refused to sell off parcels of land to bail out my father from his bad investments. My grandfather believed the land was a sacred trust, not an ATM. "It is done," Richard said. His voice carried a slick, rehearsed confidence. "The sale is finalized." I opened the folder. The document inside was a standard corporate acquisition contract. The buyer was listed as a subsidiary of a national land developer, known for paving over prime agricultural acreage to build concrete distribution hubs. They were going to raise the farmhouse, tear down the century-old silos, and suffocate the soil under acres of asphalt. "The farm is sold," Trent chimed in, leaning back against the vinyl booth and folding his arms. "Dad got the developer to expedite the closing process. We are moving forward." My pulse thumped in my ears, but I kept my breathing even. As an agricultural appraiser, I spend my life deciphering contracts exactly like this one. I am trained to spot zoning contingencies, mineral rights waivers, and liability clauses hidden deep in the fine print. I did not react to the emotional devastation of losing the farm. Instead, I let my professional training take over. I analyzed the paper in front of me. I flipped to the final page. The signature line sat at the bottom of the sheet. My grandfather's name, Silas Fletcher, was scrawled across the dotted line. Richard sat across from me, watching my face closely, waiting for the inevitable emotional breakdown. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to yell. An emotional outburst would allow him to dismiss me as hysterical, a reaction he could easily manage and ignore. But I was not looking at the name itself. I was looking at the ink. The signature was written in a vivid, cheap blue ballpoint ink. A quiet, sharp clarity washed over my mind. Exactly 1 month ago, I sat at the farmhouse kitchen table with Silas. He was wearing his favorite flannel shirt, the one with the breast pocket where he always kept a pen. That afternoon, a cheap blue ballpoint had leaked, ruining the fabric and staining his calloused fingers. Silas spent 10 minutes scrubbing his hands at the sink, cursing the cheap manufacturing. I gathered every single blue pen in the farmhouse, dumped them into a trash bag, and drove to town. I bought a fresh box of high-quality black gel pens. I placed them in his desk, on the kitchen counter, and in his truck. Since that afternoon, Silas Fletcher had not signed a single piece of paper in blue ink. I moved my eyes away from the ink and focused on the date printed beside the signature, October 12th. My memory cataloged that specific date with effortless precision. October 12th was a Tuesday. On that particular Tuesday, Silas had tripped on a loose floorboard on the back porch. He sprained his wrist and bruised his ribs. I drove him to the local clinic where the attending physician prescribed a strong muscle relaxant to help him sleep through the severe discomfort. Silas took the medication at noon. He slept deeply in his recliner until the following morning. He was so heavily sedated that he could barely hold a glass of water to his lips. He certainly did not sit down with corporate developers and sign a legally binding document transferring a multi-million-dollar estate. Richard was sitting across the table drinking a lukewarm coffee, pretending to be a grieving son. He had forged his own father's signature. He committed a felony while the man who gave him his name was fighting for his life 3 floors above us. The urge to flip the table to grab the contract and tear it into 100 pieces surged through my chest. The anger was a physical heat in my veins, but my grandfather taught me that a cornered animal is dangerous and an arrogant man is vulnerable. If I screamed accusations of forgery right now in the middle of a public cafeteria, Richard would snatch the folder back. He would destroy the evidence, hire expensive lawyers, and find another way to strip the estate. I had the advantage of surprise. I needed to secure the weapon he had just foolishly placed in my hands. I closed the manila folder and rested my hands on top of it. I smoothed my features into an expression of quiet resignation. I looked at my father, forcing my shoulders to slump just a fraction, adopting the posture of a defeated, obedient daughter. "I see," I said, keeping my voice soft and compliant. "You managed to get this sorted out very quickly." Richard smiled. It was a tight, triumphant smile. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, sensing victory. Silas knew his time was coming, Fiona. He signed off on it before the stroke. He wanted to make sure Trent and I were taken care of. He knew you had your appraisal career. He wanted to ease the burden on all of us. The lie flowed out of his mouth with sickening ease. Trent nodded along, checking his phone again, bored by a victory he assumed was already secured. "Well," I said, tapping the edge of the folder, "if the land is being transferred, I will need a copy of this entire contract. The estate taxes are going to be complicated this quarter. I have to update the probate filings and adjust the depreciation schedules for the remaining equipment. For tax preparation purposes." I spoke their language. I framed the request in the mundane, boring bureaucracy of administrative chores. I offered myself up as the diligent secretary ready to clean up the financial mess they left behind. Richard did not hesitate. The prospect of someone else handling the tedious tax paperwork appealed to his innate laziness. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a stapled photocopy of the contract, sliding it across the laminate table. "Of course," Richard said magnanimously. "Keep that for your records. Just make sure the tax burden does not fall back on the holding company. Trent and I are handling the corporate transition from here on out." I took the stapled photocopy. I felt the crisp edges of the paper against my fingertips. I slipped the document carefully into my leather tote bag, nestling it right next to the small notebook where I was tracking their every move. "I will handle the paperwork, Dad," I replied, standing up from the booth. "You do not need to worry about a thing." Richard took a sip of his coffee, looking incredibly pleased with his own intellect. Trent finally pocketed his phone and smiled at me, a condescending smirk that told me he thought I was the most gullible woman in the state of Iowa. They thought they had won. They thought they had secured a fortune and sidelined the only person who cared about the land. I turned my back on them and walked out of the cafeteria, my heels clicking a steady, even rhythm against the tiled floor. I stepped into the empty elevator and pressed the button for the intensive care unit. As the doors slid shut, hiding me from their view, I allowed myself a single cold smile. I had the forgery in my bag, and I was going to use my professional credentials to tear their lives apart piece by piece. The drive from Des Moines back to the caretaker cottage took 40 minutes. The quiet inside my truck offered a stark contrast to the buzzing hospital corridors. I gripped the steering wheel, the heater blowing warm air against my frozen hands. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the harvested cornfields. For 30 years, this land dictated the rhythm of my life. I knew the exact slope of the terraces and the precise depth of the drainage tiles. When I pulled into the gravel driveway of my small house situated on the southern boundary of our property, I did not stop to rest. I carried my leather tote bag inside, locked the deadbolt, and walked straight into my home office. My workspace was built for precision. Dual monitors glowed against the dark wood of my desk. A framed map of the county soil surveys hung on the wall. I pulled the photocopied document from my bag and smoothed it flat under the glow of a brass desk lamp. As a certified agricultural appraiser, my professional reputation relies on spotting inconsistencies that others overlook. People lie, but numbers leave a trail. I opened my appraisal software and booted up the regional real estate database. I read through the buyer provisions first. The purchaser was listed as a subsidiary of a logistics holding group. They wanted the acreage for a regional freight distribution hub. The location made strategic sense sitting just 2 miles from the interstate highway. However, when I reached the financial disclosures on page 4, I stopped breathing. The purchase price listed in the bold print was an insult. They were buying 400 acres of pristine, high-yield Iowa topsoil for less than half of the current market value. It made zero logical sense. Richard worshipped money. He spent his entire adult life chasing luxury cars, tailored suits, and country club memberships he could barely afford. He would never willingly leave millions of dollars on the negotiating table, unless the money was moving through a different channel. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon in the addendums. Buried in Section G, under a vague heading labeled Site Preparation Contingencies, I found a single sentence detailing a secondary vendor payment. The corporate developer agreed to disburse a substantial site consultation fee prior to the final closing. The payee was an entity named Golden Yield Consulting LLC. I opened a new browser window and accessed the Iowa Secretary of State Business Registry. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practice speed. I entered the LLC name into the search bar. The results populated instantly. Golden Yield Consulting was formed 3 weeks ago. The registered agents listed on the incorporation paperwork were Richard Fletcher and Trent Fletcher. The sheer audacity of their plan materialized on my screen. They were intentionally deflating the official sale price of the farm. By keeping the contract value artificially low, they reduced the total value of the estate going into probate. The corporate developer saved millions on the official purchase, and in exchange, the developer routed a quiet, untaxed kickback directly into Richard and Trent's private shell company. They were not just liquidating their father's legacy. They were actively embezzling from his estate while his heart was still beating. The sharp ring of my cell phone shattered the quiet of my office. I glanced at the caller identification. It was my mother, Diane. Diane never understood the farm. She spent her youth complaining about the smell of diesel and manure packing her bags for the suburbs the moment Richard secured his first middle management corporate job. She viewed Silas as a stubborn relic who refused to cash in his chips. I picked up the phone and accepted the call. "Fiona," she said. I heard the unmistakable clink of ice cubes against crystal in the background. She was already nursing her evening cocktail. "Richard told me you were making things difficult at the hospital today." "I am managing his medical proxy," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "The doctors require my authorization for his treatment plan." Diane sighed loudly, an exaggerated sound of profound exhaustion. "We need to be realistic about this situation. The intensive care unit charges by the hour. The specialists, the machines, the round-the-clock nursing care. It is draining the liquid assets. Your father and brother are trying to secure our financial future, and Silas is not going to wake up." I stared at the shell company registration on my monitor. The neurologist said there is still brain activity. He needs time to heal. "Time is expensive," Diane countered, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "We have to consider his quality of life. Silas would not want to live hooked up to a ventilator. It is selfish to keep him lingering. If we let him go peacefully now, the transition will be much cleaner for everyone. The closing can proceed without any messy probate delays." A cold sickness settled in the pit of my stomach. She was not talking about mercy. She was talking about expediting a payout. She wanted me to authorize the removal of his life support, so Richard and Trent could collect their illicit consulting fee faster. She was asking me to facilitate a murder of convenience. The urge to scream through the phone nearly consumed me. I wanted to tell her I knew about the forged signature. I wanted to print the LLC documents drive to her suburban subdivision and throw the evidence on her pristine granite kitchen counter. But I remembered the rule of the appraisal. You do not issue a report until all the data is verified. You do not alert the target until the trap is bolted shut. I will speak with the chief of neurology in the morning, I said, my voice eerily calm. I will make sure we are evaluating all our options. Good, Diane said, taking another sip of her drink. Be the practical girl we raised you to be. Good night, Fiona. The line went dead. I set the phone down on my desk. My hands were trembling not from sorrow, but from a profound, terrifying rage. I took a deep breath, forcing the tremor out of my fingers. Emotion is a liability during an investigation. I needed cold, hard documentation. I turned my attention back to the dual monitors. I logged into the county clerk portal and downloaded the certified articles of incorporation for Golden Yield Consulting. I captured the digital timestamps, the registered addresses, and the specific routing instructions embedded in the developer contract. I created a secure encrypted folder on my local hard drive. I named the file Silas Estate Audit. I dropped the forged contract scan into the folder. I added the LLC registration papers. I opened a fresh digital document and typed a detailed timeline of my father's actions, matching his cafeteria conversation to the specific clauses in the fraudulent paperwork. I was no longer operating as a grieving granddaughter trying to comfort her family. I was building a forensic prosecution file against my own blood. I worked late into the night cross-referencing the developer subsidiary with other regional land acquisitions, establishing a pattern of aggressive buyouts. Every piece of data fortified my position. They thought they had outsmarted a naive country girl. They forgot that I make my living dismantling complex agricultural fraud. As the clock struck 2 a.m, I finally closed my laptop. I walked into my small kitchen to pour a glass of water. Through the window over the sink, I looked out toward the main farmhouse. The structure stood dark and silent against the starlit Iowa sky. Beside it, the towering silver grain silos gleamed in the moonlight. Those silos held the tools, the vintage tractors, and the heavy machinery that built our family name. A sudden glint of headlights cut across the gravel access road leading to the equipment sheds. It was far too late for a neighboring farmer to be visiting. The distinct rumble of a heavy-duty diesel engine vibrated through the quiet night air. I set my glass down on the counter. The paperwork was only the beginning of their theft. The physical dismantling of my grandfather's life was about to begin. Morning arrived with a frost that coated the remaining corn stubble in a brittle white glaze. The headlights I had spotted during the night were only the vanguard. By the time the sun crested the horizon, the low rumble of heavy diesel engines echoed across the property line. I poured my coffee into a travel mug, grabbed my aluminum appraisal clipboard, and walked out to my truck. The drive from my caretaker cottage to the main barns took less than 2 minutes, but the scene awaiting me felt like crossing into a foreign, hostile territory. 3 commercial flatbed transport trucks sat idling in the gravel turnaround space between the machine sheds and the towering silver grain silos. Men wearing high-visibility jackets and scuffed work boots shouted instructions over the roar of the engines. They were wrapping thick steel chains around the axles of my grandfather's machinery. In rural communities across this state, agriculture is not merely an occupation. It is a shared religion. A farmer's tools are an extension of his own physical body. When an elder passes away, the equipment auction serves as a solemn ritual, a respectful gathering where neighbors bid on well-maintained machinery to keep the legacy alive in their own fields. To strip a man's barns and sell off his livelihood while he still draws breath on a hospital ventilator is an act of profound moral bankruptcy. It is an erasure of his existence. I parked my truck near the edge of the gravel lot and turned off the ignition. Sitting on the wraparound porch of the farmhouse holding a ceramic coffee mug was my older brother. Trent wore a pristine quilted jacket and expensive leather boots that had never touched fresh manure. He leaned against the wooden railing watching the transport crews with a satisfied, predatory smirk. He saw my truck pull up. He raised his mug in a mocking salute, shifting his posture to project dominance. He was waiting for a reaction. He wanted me to rush out of the cab, scream at the workers, and demand they stop the loading process. A public meltdown would validate the narrative he and my father were building. They needed me to look unstable, emotional, and unfit to handle the estate. I took a slow breath, letting the heated air from the truck vents warm my face one last time. I picked up my clipboard, stepped out into the freezing morning air, and shut the door with a quiet click. I did not run. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a professional inspecting a job site. I bypassed the farmhouse porch, entirely ignoring my brother's expectant gaze, and headed straight for the closest flatbed trailer. Resting on the trailer bed was a 1974 John Deere tractor. Silas had purchased it decades ago, spending an entire winter rebuilding the transmission in the unheated barn. The green paint was faded and the yellow wheels bore the scuffs of countless harvests, but the engine ran with flawless precision. My grandfather taught me how to drive a manual transmission on that exact machine. Now, a stranger in a neon vest was tightening a winch strap over its hood. I stepped up to the side of the trailer. I read the stamped metal identification plate bolted near the engine block. I unclipped my pen and wrote the 17-character serial number onto my ledger. I moved down the line to the combine harvester, logging the model year, the engine hours visible on the digital dash, and the tread wear on the massive rear tires. A man holding a digital tablet and a stack of paperwork separated himself from the loading crew and walked toward me. He wore a fleece vest bearing the logo of a regional agricultural liquidator. He eyed my clipboard, his expression tight with anticipated conflict. Auction managers despise unexpected family disputes during a pickup. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone guarded. I offered him a polite, disarming smile. I did not raise my voice or let my underlying fury bleed into my cadence. "Good morning," I said, keeping my posture relaxed. "I am the agricultural appraiser handling the probate preparation for the Fletcher estate. I am just completing the asset transfer inventory. I need to ensure our internal records match the bill of lading you are preparing." The auction manager exhaled, his defensive posture instantly dissolving. He believed he was speaking to a hired consultant, a fellow professional simply executing a tedious administrative duty. "Of course," he replied, tapping the screen of his tablet. "Richard Fletcher finalized the remote sale yesterday afternoon. We are just the transport crew moving the inventory to the holding lot before the winter auction block." "I understand," I said, writing another sequence of numbers onto my pad. "I will need the carbon copies of the transfer receipts. We need to document the exact departure timestamps and the transit liability clauses for the tax record. The accountants are very specific about the depreciation schedules." The mention of accountants and tax ledgers solidified his comfort. He reached into a plastic folder clipped to his belt and pulled out 3 yellow duplicate sheets. "Here you go," the manager said, handing over the documents. "Everything is itemized. Tractor combine utility vehicles and the portable grain augers." I took the yellow sheets, placing them securely under the metal clip of my board. "Thank you. Drive safely." I turned around to find Trent standing a few feet away. He had descended the porch stairs and walked across the gravel, curious about my lack of hysterics. His pristine boots were carefully avoiding the muddy ruts left by the transport trucks. "Taking inventory, Fiona?" Trent asked. A mocking laugh sat just beneath his words. "The tax liabilities require accurate documentation," I replied, my voice reflecting nothing but dull bureaucratic duty. Trent shook his head, a gesture steeped in condescension. He took a sip of his coffee, looking at the empty machine sheds behind me. "Dad told me you would fall in line once you saw the reality of the situation," Trent said, stepping closer to invade my personal space. "You always were good at counting the pennies. Every transition needs an obedient secretary to handle the filing." I looked him directly in the eyes. I did not correct his assumption. I let him bathe in his false superiority. An arrogant opponent is a blind opponent, and Trent was actively blinding himself to the trap closing around his ankles. "I will make sure the files are organized," I said. Trent chuckled, turning his back on me to watch the first flatbed truck pull out of the driveway. The diesel exhaust billowed into the cold air, carrying away the machinery that built our family name. I stood in the gravel lot and watched the legacy disappear down the county road. The towering grain silos now cast long, empty shadows over vacant dirt. I held the yellow carbon receipts tightly against my chest. Trent thought I was performing secretarial duties for his benefit. He did not realize I was assembling a meticulous, undeniable chain of evidence for grand larceny. He walked back up the porch steps, retreating into the warmth of the farmhouse, leaving me alone in the cold. The asset stripping was nearly complete, but I knew their greed would not stop at the property line. With the machinery gone, they only had one obstacle left standing on the acreage: As the sound of the transport trucks faded into the distance, I knew my own home would be the next target on their list. The caretaker cottage sat on the southern boundary of the Fletcher property, shielded from the county highway by a dense row of ancient bur oaks. My grandfather built the structure with his own hands 50 years ago, hauling river stone from the creek bed to construct the chimney. He lived in this modest footprint while he saved enough money from his early harvests to renovate the main farmhouse. I moved into the cottage 6 years ago, transforming the spare bedroom into my appraisal office. The space smelled of cedar wood smoke and old paper. It was not just a house. It was the physical anchor of my adult life. I was standing at my drafting table, organizing the yellow carbon receipts from the morning equipment theft, when the crunch of tires on gravel interrupted my focus. I walked to the front window. My father's luxury sport utility vehicle idled near my front porch. Richard shifted the transmission into park. The passenger door opened and my mother stepped out onto the dirt driveway. Diane had not visited the farm in over a decade. She despised the dust, the isolation, and the constant hum of the cicadas. Today she wore a pristine beige trench coat and a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, looking like a tourist who had taken a wrong turn into rural Iowa. Richard walked around the hood of the vehicle, his posture rigid and formal. He held a crisp white envelope in his right hand. I did not wait for them to knock. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out onto the porch, letting the cold afternoon air sting my cheeks. "Hello, Mother," I said, keeping my hands resting casually in the pockets of my jeans. Diane offered a tight, sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. "Fiona, darling, we thought it would be best to speak with you in person." Richard walked up those wooden steps, stopping just short of my personal space. He extended his arm, holding the white envelope out toward my chest. He did not offer a greeting. He simply delivered the blow he believed would finally sever my connection to the soil. "Notice to vacate," Richard stated, his voice stripped of any familial warmth. "The corporate developer requires this specific parcel for an asphalt access road. They are routing a 4-lane heavy truck thoroughfare directly through this grove to connect the highway to the new logistics hub. The demolition crews need the site cleared." I looked down at the envelope. I did not take it from his hand. "The closing has not been certified by a probate judge," I replied, stating a basic legal fact. "The sale is proceeding under the parameters of the executive transition," Richard countered, waving the paper slightly. "The holding company took preliminary ownership this morning. They are eager to begin the site preparation. You are living on a construction zone, Fiona." Diane stepped closer, placing a manicured hand on the wooden porch railing. She tilted her head, adopting the tone of a concerned parent offering gentle guidance to a wayward child. "You can rent a nice apartment in town, Fiona," Diane said, her voice dripping with performative pity. "There are lovely modern lofts near the Civic Center. They have fitness centers and covered parking. You need to stop dragging the family down with all this nostalgic farm nonsense. It is time for you to join the real world and let your father secure our future." Her words were designed to provoke. She wanted me to defend my lifestyle, to argue the value of the land, to scream that this dirt meant more than a modern loft. She framed the destruction of my home as a necessary lifestyle upgrade, dismissing my entire existence as a stubborn phase. I finally reached out and took the envelope from my father. I ran my thumb over the sharp paper edge. Inside this envelope was a standard legal demand. It represented the eradication of my sanctuary. The developers were going to tear down the Riverstone chimney, uproot the bur oaks, and pave over the exact spot where I learned to walk. The heat of genuine fury sparked in my chest, a burning desire to slap the envelope back into his face and tell him I knew the developer contract was built on a forged signature. If I revealed my hand now, the satisfaction would last 5 seconds. Richard would immediately panic, hire a team of defense attorneys, and tie the estate up in endless litigation. He would find a way to silence me. I folded the envelope in half and slipped it into my pocket. I looked at my father, draining every ounce of emotion from my face. I gave him the empty, defeated stare of a woman who had finally run out of options. "I understand," I said softly. "I will need the standard 30 days to pack my belongings." Richard exhaled, his chest puffing out with victorious pride. He believed he had broken my spirit. He believed he had uprooted me from the land and removed the final physical barrier to his multi-million-dollar payout. 30 days. Richard agreed, offering a magnanimous nod. "Take whatever furniture you want." The developer is just going to bulldoze the rest." Diane smiled, pleased that the unpleasantness had concluded without a shouting match. She turned and walked briskly back to the heated interior of the luxury vehicle. Richard followed her, climbing into the driver's seat without looking back. They reversed out of the driveway, kicking up a cloud of loose gravel, leaving me standing alone on the porch of a condemned house. I stood in the cold until the sound of their engine faded into the wind. I turned around, walked back inside my cottage, and locked the heavy deadbolt. I did not walk into my bedroom. I did not pull suitcases from the closet or begin sorting my clothes. My personal belongings were irrelevant. I walked straight into my office and approached the heavy fireproof filing cabinets lining the back wall. My grandfather entrusted me with the historical record of the Fletcher farm. I pulled open the heavy steel drawers. Inside sat decades of Silas's handwritten agricultural ledgers. These leather-bound books contained the true soul of the property. Silas recorded seed costs, rainfall measurements, diesel prices, and harvest yields with meticulous, honest precision. His authentic handwriting filled thousands of pages, establishing a flawless baseline that would make Richard's sloppy blue ink forgery look like the work of a careless child. I retrieved 6 sturdy plastic storage bins from the basement. I lined the bottom of the first bin with the yellow carbon receipts from the morning equipment liquidator. I added the printed county clerk records for Golden Yield Consulting, the shell company my father and brother incorporated to collect their illicit kickback. I placed the photocopied developer contract containing the forged signature into a waterproof document sleeve and laid it gently on top of the corporate filings. I spent the next 3 hours packing the financial ledgers, the tax returns, and the historical property deeds into the remaining plastic bins. I cataloged every piece of evidence, creating a master index on my encrypted digital tablet. I was not packing a household. I was packaging a grand jury indictment. When the bins were full and securely latched, I loaded them into the bed of my truck. I covered the cargo with a heavy canvas tarp and secured it with nylon straps. I drove into Des Moines, bypassing the hospital district, and headed toward an industrial park on the west side of the city. I parked outside a newly constructed climate-controlled storage facility. I walked into the leasing office and rented a premium interior unit. I did not use my own name on the rental agreement. I registered the unit under the name of a dormant appraisal LLC I established years ago for freelance consulting. Richard and Trent could search public records all they wanted. They would never connect the storage unit to me. I spent an hour transferring the heavy plastic bins from my truck bed into the secure metal room. The air inside the facility was dry and sterile, humming with the sound of overhead ventilation fans. I stacked the bins in a neat uniform column in the center of the unit. I stepped out into the hallway and pulled the rolling metal door downward. The latch hit the concrete floor with a resounding metallic clang. I slid a heavy steel padlock through the hasp and clicked it shut. I spun the combination dial, scrambling the numbers. The battlefield was prepared. The evidence was safe, hidden far away from the reach of the corporate developers and my greedy family. The physical house might fall to the bulldozers, but the foundation of the Fletcher legacy was locked behind a steel door, waiting for the proper moment to detonate. I walked back to my truck, my hands empty, but my purpose entirely renewed. I checked the clock on my dashboard. It was time to return to the intensive care unit. I needed to sit beside my grandfather, hold his hand, and tell him the truth about the war raging outside his hospital window. The transition from the cold concrete of the storage facility to the sterile climate-controlled environment of the intensive care unit felt disorienting. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the hospital, the weight of the padlock key resting heavy in my coat pocket. The scent of bleach and floor wax replaced the smell of diesel and frost. I navigated the familiar labyrinth of corridors, my boots squeaking softly against the polished linoleum. When I reached the 4th floor, the atmosphere shifted. The ICU operates on a different frequency, defined by hushed voices, padded footsteps, and the relentless chirping of telemetry monitors. I approached room 412, preparing to resume my silent vigil beside my grandfather. Before I could touch the door handle, a hand gently grasped my elbow. I turned to find the senior charge nurse standing beside me. She was a pragmatic woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and a posture built from decades of hauling patients and managing grief. She wore navy blue scrubs and carried a wireless charting tablet. "Fiona Sai," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder to ensure the hallway remained empty. "I need to speak with you before you go in there." I stepped away from the door, my pulse quickening. Has his condition changed? Did his intracranial pressure rise? The nurse shook her head, pulling me closer to the nurse's station alcove. Physiologically, his baseline remains stable. But I have been monitoring his telemetry readouts from the central desk all afternoon. Your father and your brother are in there right now. I stiffened. Richard and Trent had spent the entire morning liquidating the farm equipment. I expected them to be celebrating, not visiting the man they were robbing. They have been standing by the bed for 20 minutes. The nurse continued, her voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur. They are discussing the real estate transaction. The contract, the developer, the site preparation. And Fiona, every time they mention selling the acreage, your grandfather's heart rate spikes. His blood pressure climbs into the danger zone. The alarms do not trigger at the bedside because I adjusted the thresholds, but I see the data on my screen. I is experiencing severe physiological distress. The implications of her words washed over me like a bucket of ice water. Silas was not drifting in an empty void. He was locked inside the dark prison of his own failing body, unable to move, unable to open his eyes, but he could hear them. He was lying in that bed, trapped in silence, listening to his own son and grandson carve up his legacy and sell it to the highest bidder. 5 years ago, Silas tore a meniscus tendon working the south pasture. It was a routine injury requiring a simple outpatient arthroscopic procedure. Richard immediately tried to use the surgery as an excuse to petition for conservatorship, arguing that Silas was getting too old to live alone and belonged in an assisted care facility. Silas fought back, hired a lawyer, and legally designated me as his sole medical proxy. He knew Richard would use any medical vulnerability as a weapon. Now that weapon was being deployed while Silas was defenseless. "Thank you," I said to the nurse, my voice hardening into steel. "I will handle this." I turned away from this alcove, walked to room 412, and pushed the heavy wooden door open. Richard stood near the window, his arms crossed over his tailored blazer. Trent leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone. Diane sat in the visitor chair, flipping through a glossy lifestyle magazine. They looked like they were waiting in an airport lounge. "The demolition crews can start on the outer fence line by Monday," Richard was saying, oblivious to my entrance. "The buyer wants the ground leveled before the first hard freeze sets in. We need the zoning variances cleared." Silas lay motionless on the bed. I glanced at the monitor above his head. His heart rate was elevated, hovering at a frantic, anxious rhythm. "You need to leave," I said. My voice cut through the room, sharp and precise. Richard stopped talking. Trent looked up from his screen. Diane lowered her magazine, her brow furrowing in irritation. "Excuse me," Richard asked, offering a patronizing chuckle. "We are having a private conversation, Fiona." "You are having a conversation about liquidating a commercial property in a critical care environment," I replied, stepping past them to stand directly between Silas and my father. "Your presence is causing the patient acute distress. You need to leave this room immediately, and you are not coming back." Richard's face flushed a deep, ugly red. The polite facade evaporated, revealing the arrogant bully lurking underneath. He took a step forward, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "You do not give orders here," Richard snapped, pointing a finger at my chest. "This is my father. I am his next of kin. If you think you can play gatekeeper, I will have my attorneys petition the probate court tomorrow morning to strip you of that proxy. You are a glorified consultant, Fiona. Do not overstep." I did not flinch. I did not raise my volume to match his anger. I anchored my boots to the linoleum floor and deployed the legal authority my grandfather had legally entrusted to me. Under the Iowa Uniform Healthcare Decisions Act, I hold durable power of attorney for healthcare, I recited, delivering the words with cold, mechanical precision. That document supersedes standard next-of-kin hierarchies. Furthermore, under hospital policy and HIPAA privacy regulations, the designated proxy has the sole authority to restrict visitation if the visitors pose a physiological or psychological threat to the patient. The charge nurse has already documented a sustained spike in his cardiac rhythm, directly correlating with your conversations. I held Richard's gaze, letting the silence stretch, daring him to challenge the law. "If you do not walk out that door right now," I continued, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. I will press the call button and security will escort you through the lobby in front of every doctor, nurse, and grieving family in this wing. The choice is yours. Richard stared at me. He recognized the shift in my demeanor. I was no longer playing the obedient secretary. Diane stood up quickly, tossing the magazine onto the chair. She hated public scenes more than she hated the farm. Let it go, Richard, Diane muttered, grabbing her purse. She is just being dramatic. We have better things to do. The developer is waiting for our call. Trent pushed off the wall, shaking his head. Enjoy the vigil, Fiona, he sneered. Richard glared at me for one long, silent moment before turning on his heel. The three of them filed out of the room. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind them, sealing the room in quiet isolation. I stood frozen for a minute, waiting for the adrenaline to recede from my veins. I looked up at the monitor. Slowly, steadily, the erratic spiking of Silas's heart rate began to slow. The rhythm leveled out, returning to a calm, sustainable pace. The nurse was right. He knew they were gone. I pulled the vinyl visitor chair close to the edge of the mattress. I sat down and reached through this tangle of intravenous lines, sliding my hand over his calloused knuckles. His skin was warm and rough, a familiar texture that grounded me. For the past 3 days, I had maintained a flawless detached armor. I calculated, I appraised, and I documented. I survived by treating my family like a hostile corporate takeover, but sitting alone in the dim light of the hospital room, looking at the man who taught me how to read the clouds for rain, the armor finally cracked. A single tear slipped down my cheek, hot and uninvited. I squeezed his hand, leaning forward until my lips were close to his ear. I know you can hear me, Grandpa, I whispered, my voice thick with unshed grief. I know you heard them. I am so sorry. The ventilator hissed, pushing air into his lungs. They sold the farm. I continued, speaking the ugly truth into the quiet room. Richard forged your signature with a blue pen on the developer contract. They set up a fake consulting company to take a kickback from the buyers. Trent auctioned off your tractors this morning. The green John Deere is gone. I swallowed the knot forming in my throat, keeping my voice steady enough for him to understand. Dad gave me an eviction notice this afternoon, I whispered. They are going to bulldoze the caretaker cottage to build a road. But you do not need to worry. I did not fight them. I did not let them know I found the fraud. I packed the ledgers. I packed the tax records. I have the receipts from the auction, and I have the incorporation papers for their shell company. Everything is locked in a storage unit. I rested my forehead against the edge of the mattress, letting my tears soak into the pristine white sheets. I am building a case, Silas. I am going to let them finalize the sale, and then I am going to tear them apart. You just need to hold on. Please, just hold on. I sat up and wiped my face. I looked at the monitor. The green line moved in a steady rhythmic wave. I stared at his closed eyelids, searching for a flicker of movement, a twitch of a muscle, any sign that he understood the war I was fighting on his behalf. The machines beeped in the quiet room, keeping time while I sat in the stillness and wondered if he would ever wake up to see the trap I had set. The respiratory therapist removed the endotracheal tube shortly after dawn, exchanging the invasive plastic pipe for a clear oxygen mask. The physician warned me the transition was merely a standard protocol to prevent infection. He told me Silas remained locked in a deep neurological deficit and cautioned me against false hope. I sat in the vinyl visitor chair, the glow of my encrypted tablet illuminating the dark room. I was reviewing the digital copies of the forged contract, memorizing every fraudulent clause and identifying every legal vulnerability. The wall clock ticked past 3 in the morning. The intensive care unit settled into a hollow, eerie stillness. I rested my hand over my grandfather's knuckles, feeling the steady rhythmic pulse beneath his fragile skin. Then his fingers moved. It was not an involuntary muscle spasm. The motion possessed deliberate, undeniable intent. His index finger curled inward, pressing firmly against my palm. I froze my breath, catching in my throat. I set my tablet on the side table and leaned closer to the edge of the mattress. Silas opened his eyes. The cerebral hemorrhage had ravaged his body. The right side of his face drooped, pulling the corner of his mouth downward into a slack, unnatural line. The skin around his jaw appeared gray and hollowed out by days of intravenous feeding. Yet despite the devastating physical toll, his pale blue eyes held a fierce, unmistakable clarity. The fog of the coma was gone. He was looking directly at me, and his gaze burned with an ancient, quiet fury. "Grandpa," I breathed the word, catching on the edge of a sob. I stood up, reaching for the red call button clipped to his bed rail. I wanted to summon the neurologist to flood the room with medical staff to celebrate the miracle of his return to the waking world. His hand tightened around my fingers. The grip lacked his former callous strength, but the urgency in his touch stopped my arm midway through the air. He shook his head. The motion was barely a fraction of an inch, a microscopic pivot against the sterile hospital pillow, but it carried the weight of a direct command. He lifted his functioning left hand, his arm trembling with the monumental effort, and pushed the plastic oxygen mask down to rest against his chin. "Do not call them," Silas whispered. His voice sounded like dry leaves scraping across a gravel road, brittle and hollowed out by days of intubation. "The doctors need to examine you," I urged, keeping my voice low. "They need to check your cognitive function and stabilize your vitals." "Let the doctors wait," Silas rasped, forcing each syllable through his damaged throat. "Listen to me, Fiona." I lowered my arm, abandoning the call button. I leaned in until my ear was inches from his face, giving him my undivided focus. In the dim light of the clinical room, the space between us transformed into a secure bunker. We were no longer a grieving granddaughter and a dying patriarch. We were two soldiers assessing a hostile battlefield. "I heard them," Silas said, his breathing shallow and labored. "I heard Richard. I heard Trent. Standing right there." He shifted his gaze toward the window, marking the exact spot where his son and grandson had stood hours earlier, casually planning the destruction of his life. "They thought I was gone." Silas continued, a bitter edge sharpening his whisper. "I was floating in the dark. I could not move my arms. I could not open my eyes. But the sound came through. I heard them talking about the asphalt, about the developer, about selling the acres my grandfather cleared with a crosscut saw." A cold tear slipped down my cheek, tracing the line of my jaw. "They brought a contract to the cafeteria yesterday. Richard showed it to me. He said you authorized the sale before your stroke." Silas closed his eyes for a brief second, gathering his strength. Richard always looked for the shortcut. When he was 16 during the autumn soybean harvest, he faked a twisted ankle just to sit inside the air-conditioned truck while you and I walked the fence line repairing the wire. He hates the dirt. He hates the work, but he loves the equity. Silas opened his eyes, pinning me with a stare that held no room for doubt. "I did not sign a single page," Silas stated, his voice gaining a fraction of its old authority. "I never spoke to a corporate developer. Your father forged my name." "I know," I replied, squeezing his hand. "He used blue ink. I remembered you threw all the blue pens away last month because they leaked." He backdated the document to the Tuesday you took those heavy muscle relaxants for your bruised ribs. The timeline is fabricated. A faint, grim smile touched the unparalyzed side of Silas's mouth. Pride shone in his pale eyes. "You always were sharp, Fiona," he whispered. "You see the details they ignore." I documented everything. I told him, the words tumbling out in a quiet rush. "I have the carbon receipts from the tractor auction Trent ran this morning. I pulled the public filings for the shell company they set up to accept the developer kickback. I secured all your historical ledgers in a private climate-controlled storage unit. They served me with an eviction notice for the cottage, but I did not fight them. I let them think I surrendered." Silas let out a slow, rattling breath. "Good. You gave them enough slack to hang themselves. I can take this to the police right now," I offered, pulling the encrypted tablet into my lap. "I have enough circumstantial evidence to initiate a grand jury investigation for fraud. If we show the doctors you are awake, the hospital will testify to your cognitive state. We can stop the corporate closing tomorrow morning." "No," Silas commanded, his fingers digging into my palm. I paused, confused by his resistance. "If you go to the police now," Silas explained, pacing his breaths, "Richard will claim it was a simple misunderstanding. He will hire a team of expensive defense lawyers. He will say he was acting in the best interest of the estate because he thought I was dying. They will tie the farm up in probate court for a decade. He might avoid prison time." Silas pulled the oxygen mask back up over his nose and mouth, taking several deep, concentrated breaths of the purified air. He pushed the plastic aside again, his jaw set with iron resolve. He tried to steal our land. Silas rasped, his eyes cold and unyielding. He sold out his own father while I was lying in a hospital bed. We are not going to stop the closing, Fiona. We are going to let him finalize the deal. The sheer audacity of his plan sent a shockwave through my chest. He wanted Richard to cross the point of no return. We need Richard to believe I am still in a coma, Silas instructed. He needs to feel invincible. He needs to walk into that corporate boardroom and sign those federal wire transfer affidavits. He needs to commit perjury on the official record. Once the money moves across state lines, the federal authorities will not treat it as a family dispute. They will treat it as felony wire fraud. I stared at my grandfather, recognizing the brilliant, ruthless logic of his strategy. My father and my brother cast us both aside. They looked at Silas and saw a decaying corpse blocking their payday. They looked at me and saw an obedient, disposable secretary. They underestimated our intelligence, our loyalty, and our deep abiding connection to the soil beneath our boots. Now we were going to quietly dismantle their entire existence. I will inform the charge nurse that you regained consciousness, I said, mapping out the logistics in my mind. I will use my medical proxy to place a strict privacy block on your chart. The hospital staff will be legally prohibited from contacting Richard, Trent, or Diane. As far as the outside world is concerned, you are still unresponsive and fading fast. Silas nodded, a gesture of profound approval. We sat together in the dim light of the clinical room, sharing a silent vow. The grief that had suffocated me for the past 4 days evaporated, replaced by a cold, methodical purpose. We were no longer waiting for a tragedy to conclude. We were laying the final bricks of a trap. Silas reached up and adjusted the oxygen mask, preparing to rest. His energy reserves were rapidly depleting, but before he closed his eyes, he gestured for me to lean in one last time. The forgery is a good weapon, Silas whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the machines. But it is not the only weapon we have. There is a reason I was not worried about Richard selling the farm. I frowned, leaning closer. What do you mean? On the morning of my stroke, Silas murmured, fighting the exhaustion pulling at his eyelids. My left arm went numb. I knew something was wrong. I knew Richard would come looking for the paper trail if I fell. I hid something, Fiona. Something he does not know exists. The morning it happened. Silas breathed, his voice a brittle rasp against the plastic oxygen mask. I woke up before dawn to check the commodity reports on the radio. My left arm felt heavy like a sack of wet feed. I tried to lift my coffee cup and my fingers would not close around the ceramic handle. The numbness crept up my shoulder and settled into my jaw. He paused, drawing a shallow, measured breath. I knew the symptoms. He continued, keeping his pale eyes locked on mine. I knew a stroke was taking hold of my brain. And I knew the moment I fell unconscious, Richard would descend on this farm like a starved coyote. He has coveted the equity in this dirt since he was a teenager. I realized I had maybe 10 minutes of mobility left before the clot finished the job. What did you do? I asked, leaning closer to the bed rail. I walked into my bedroom, Silas said, the memory sharpening his focus. I took the most dangerous piece of leverage I own. I put it inside a vintage metal tobacco tin. I sliced open the inner lining of my favorite pillowcase, slipped the tin deep inside the feather stuffing, and sewed the fabric shut with a heavy upholstery needle. I finished the final stitch right as my legs gave out. I crawled out the back door and into the pasture so they would not find me in the bedroom. I wanted them looking the wrong way. The raw survival instinct of the man sitting before me defied basic medical science. He orchestrated a brilliant misdirection while his own neurological system was collapsing. Trent is staying in the main house, I whispered, calculating the logistics. He moved his things into the guest room the day they handed me the eviction notice for the cottage. Trent is lazy, Silas replied, a hard glint shining in his eyes. He will not be awake early, and if he is, he will be in town spending money he thinks he has already secured. Go to the farmhouse, Fiona. Bypass your brother. Find the blue striped pillowcase on the left side of my mattress. Bring the tin to me. I left the intensive care unit just as the morning shift nurses arrived for their rotations. The sunrise painted the Iowa sky in bruised shades of purple and gold. I drove my truck back down the county highway, my mind replaying my grandfather's urgent instructions. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I approached the familiar driveway. I parked my truck behind the long row of bur oaks concealing the vehicle from the main road. I walked the remaining quarter-mile on foot, staying close to the tree line. The biting morning air cut through my canvas jacket. When the main farmhouse came into view, I let out a slow, quiet breath of relief. Trent's newly purchased oversized luxury pickup truck was missing from the gravel turnaround. My brother possessed a highly predictable arrogance, armed with the promise of a lucrative, untaxed kickback from the corporate buyer. Trent was undoubtedly sitting in a high-end dealership in Des Moines, selecting leather interior options for a vehicle he planned to buy on credit. I was treating the farm like a winning lottery ticket. I stepped onto the wraparound porch, placing my boots lightly on the wooden planks to avoid the familiar creaking floorboards. I pulled my old spare key from my pocket, slid it into the heavy brass lock, and turned the cylinder. The house smelled of stale coffee and cedar wood, a comforting scent that had defined my entire childhood. I locked the front door behind me. The interior felt violated. Trent had left his expensive boots in the center of the hallway and tossed a pile of glossy real estate brochures onto the antique dining table. He was already planning his new life in the city. I ignored the mess and moved swiftly toward the back hallway. Silas kept a Spartan bedroom on the ground floor, a practical choice he made after his knees began to fail a decade ago. I turned the brass knob and pushed his bedroom door open. The room remained exactly as he left it on the morning of his stroke. The quilt lay rumpled, tossed hastily toward the footboard. A pair of worn denim work pants rested over the back of a wooden chair. I approached the mattress, keeping my ears tuned for the sound of approaching tires on the gravel outside. 2 pillows sat near the oak headboard. One was encased in a plain white cotton slip. The other bore a faded pattern of thin blue stripes. I picked up the striped pillow. It felt remarkably heavy for its size. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a small folding pocket knife I used for soil sampling. I flicked the steel blade open. I traced the edge of the pillowcase until I found a section of stitching that looked thicker and more erratic than the neat factory hem. Silas had used a thick black thread to close the seam. I slid the sharp edge of my knife under the black thread, severing the stitches one by one. I reached my hand deep into the feather, stuffing my fingers, brushing against cold, rigid metal. I pulled the object free. It was a vintage tin, the kind used to store loose-leaf pipe tobacco 50 years ago. The lid was rusted along the edges, sealing it tight. I pried the metal top off with the flat edge of my knife. Inside the tin rested 2 items. The first was a long brass safety deposit key stamped with the logo of a private regional bank located 3 counties away. Silas had bypassed the local town bank, ensuring no gossiping tellers could alert Richard to his financial movements. The second item was a stiff premium cardstock business card. The name printed in embossed serif font read Vincent Mitchell, attorney at law. Below the name sat a direct mobile phone number. I recognized the name immediately. Vincent Mitchell was not a local small-town lawyer who handled simple wills and basic property line disputes. He was a ruthless, highly specialized estate litigator based in the capital. He was known for dismantling complex corporate trusts and destroying hostile heirs in probate court. He was a legal shark, and Richard had no idea the man existed. Richard assumed Silas relied on the aging, easily manipulated family lawyer whose office sat above the diner on Main Street. I secured the lid back onto the tin and slipped it deep into my coat pocket. I smoothed the feathers inside the pillowcase and turned the fabric over, hiding the sliced seam against the mattress. I left the farmhouse exactly as I found it, locking the front door and walking back to my hidden truck through the morning frost. The drive back to the hospital felt entirely different. The crushing anxiety of the past 4 days vanished, replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. I held the key to my father's undoing in my pocket. I navigated the hospital corridors and returned to the 4th floor. The charge nurse gave me a silent nod as I passed the central desk. She had implemented the strict privacy protocols flawlessly. On paper, Silas Fletcher was fading into the end stages of a terminal coma. The hospital switchboard was instructed to inform all callers that his condition remained critical and unresponsive. I pushed open the door to room 412. Silas was sitting up at a slight incline, his pale eyes tracking my movement the moment I entered. He looked exhausted, but the fierce determination in his posture remained unbroken. I walked to the bedside and reached into my coat. I pulled out the rusted tobacco tin and placed it onto the sterile rolling tray traversing his bed. Silas looked at the metal box. For the first time since he collapsed in the north pasture, a genuine smile touched the functioning side of his face. It was a dark, predatory smile. It was the expression of a farmer watching a coyote step directly into a steel trap. Trent was out, I whispered, pulling the visitor chair close to the mattress. He is likely in the city financing a new truck. The house was empty. I found the striped pillowcase and cut the seam. I opened the tin, revealing the brass key and the embossed business card. Vincent Mitchell. Silas rasped, tapping the card with his index finger. Richard thinks I am a knave old fool who keeps his paperwork in a floor safe. He thinks I used the local firm in town. He does not know I retained Vincent 5 years ago to structure an airtight fortress around this land. Silas picked up the business card and handed it to me. His hand trembled, but his grip on the paper was unyielding. Dial the number Fiona, my grandfather commanded. Tell Vincent I am awake. Tell him Richard took the bait. I pulled my cell phone from my purse and dialed the digits printed on the card. I listened to the line ring, standing in the quiet hum of the intensive care unit. Across the city, Richard was likely sitting in a plush leather chair, sipping expensive coffee and finalizing the guest list for his celebratory closing dinner. He believed he had outsmarted his dying father and sidelined his obedient daughter. He was currently planning his victory lap, blissfully unaware of the legal guillotine we had just hoisted silently into the air directly above his neck. The phone line connected on the second ring. A crisp, authoritative voice answered, demanding no pleasantries. I identified myself standing in the dim light of the intensive care unit and relayed my grandfather's instructions. Vincent Mitchell did not waste syllables expressing shock or offering hollow sympathy regarding the stroke. He asked for the hospital name, requested the room number, and instructed me to ensure the nursing staff kept the privacy protocol active. He promised to arrive within the hour. I spent the next 60 minutes watching the rhythmic rise and fall of my grandfather's chest. Silas rested his eyes, conserving the fragile energy he had expended during our conversation. The silence in the room felt heavy, loaded with the weight of impending retribution. The heavy wooden door clicked open, breaking the quiet. Vincent Mitchell stepped into the room. He wore a sharp charcoal suit that spoke of high billing rates and ruthless efficiency. He carried a battered leather briefcase, its worn edges betraying decades of courtroom combat. He approached the bed, his stern expression softening only a fraction as he looked down at his client. Mitchell set his briefcase onto the rolling plastic tray. He disengaged the brass locks with a sharp snap. "It is good to see you awake, Silas," Mitchell said quietly. "I assume Richard took the bait." Silas opened his eyes. A grim, satisfied light flickered in his gaze. "He took every inch of it, Vincent." Mitchell turned his attention to me. He did not offer a comforting handshake. He offered the truth. He began the explanation with the precision of a surgeon. 5 years prior, Richard had pitched a luxury condominium development on the western edge of Des Moines. The venture required immense upfront capital. Richard drove to the farmhouse and demanded Silas leverage the property to fund the construction. Silas refused. Richard threw a bitter, desperate tantrum in the kitchen, threatening to declare his own father mentally unfit to manage the estate. That was the turning point. Silas realized his son viewed him not as a parent, but as a stubborn obstacle standing in front of a vault. Silas traveled to this capital the very next morning in secret. He hired Mitchell to construct an impenetrable legal fortress around the soil. "Your grandfather instructed me to draft an irrevocable blind trust." Mitchell explained, his voice low and steady. He transferred the deed, the water rights, the mineral rights, and every physical asset of the farm into this entity. He relinquished his personal ownership entirely. To the outside world, the county tax records showed the property registered to an obscure agricultural holding company. Richard never looked close enough to realize the holding company was not controlled by Silas. Mitchell pulled a thick, bound document from his briefcase. He handed the heavy stack of paper to me. I opened the dark blue cover. The legal text was dense, but the primary clauses were glaringly clear. The trust stipulated that upon the death of the grantor, or upon the medical certification of his incapacitation, the entire estate transferred to a singular beneficiary. My name sat printed in bold black ink on the page. The realization hit my chest with profound force. I looked at the man lying in the hospital bed. He had protected me. He had protected the soil. He knew I was the only person in our bloodline who respected the sweat and the harvest. I had spent the past 4 days believing I was fighting an uphill battle to save his legacy. I had held the true power the entire time. I looked back at the attorney, my mind processing the legal ramifications of the forgery. "Richard forged my grandfather's signature on a commercial sales contract yesterday," I said, tracing the embossed seal on the trust document. "He intends to sell the acreage to a corporate logistics developer. He already negotiated a secondary site preparation fee to be routed into his private shell company." Mitchell offered a chilling, predatory smile. "Your father forged a signature belonging to a man who does not own the property," Mitchell stated quietly. "Silas cannot sell that farm. The contract your father drafted is not just fraudulent. It is a legal impossibility. The corporate developer is purchasing thin air." The urge to act surged through my veins. I wanted to stand up, march into Richard's suburban house, and drop the trust document onto his pristine coffee table. I wanted to watch the color drain from his face as he realized his lucrative payout was a phantom. "We can stop them right now," I said, my voice tight with anticipated justice. "We can serve them with an injunction today. We can hand the forged contract over to the district attorney." Silas reached out. His frail hand covered mine on the edge of the mattress. "No," he whispered. Mitchell nodded in agreement, leaning against the sterile wall of the hospital room. "Your grandfather is correct, Fiona," Mitchell said. "If we reveal the trust now, Richard will simply walk away. He will claim the forged contract was a draft. He will say he was acting in the best interest of the estate during a medical emergency. The local prosecutor might view it as a messy civil dispute between family members. Richard would face public embarrassment and perhaps a minor financial penalty, but he would evade any true consequence." Mitchell detailed the impending corporate closing process. The developer would require Richard and Trent to sign sworn affidavits of title. They would have to stand in a room, place their signatures on federal documents, and swear under penalty of perjury that they held free and clear ownership of the land. Furthermore, the developer would transfer the purchase funds and the illicit consulting kickback via electronic wire. "Once that money crosses a state line through a digital banking network," Mitchell said, his tone turning razor sharp, "this ceases to be a local forgery case. It becomes federal wire fraud. It carries severe mandatory sentencing. We are not going to slap their wrists. We are going to let them commit a federal crime on the official record." I stared at the attorney, recognizing the brilliant, devastating trap they had constructed. "Give him the rope." Silas rasped from the bed, his eyes fixed on mine. "Let him tie the knot." Mitchell zipped his briefcase shut, the brass locks snapping into place. He looked at me with assessing eyes. "Richard will finalize the sale on Friday morning," Mitchell predicted. "He will want you there. He will invite you to the closing meeting, not because he needs your signature, but because he wants an audience for his victory. He wants to watch you lose." I understood my assignment. I had to walk into the corporate office of the developer. I had to wear the mask of the defeated, obedient daughter. I had to watch my father and my brother celebrate their theft, knowing all the while that their celebration was the exact mechanism of their impending incarceration. I handed the trust document back to Mitchell. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves for the performance ahead. I was ready to attend a closing. The elevator ride to the 50th floor of the corporate logistics headquarters caused a slight pressure in my ears. I stepped out into a sprawling lobby encased in floor-to-ceiling glass. The pristine skyline of downtown Des Moines stretched out beyond the window panes. A stark contrast to the freezing, muddy fields where my grandfather currently fought for his next breath. I wore my tailored navy blazer and sensible leather heels, the standard uniform of an agricultural appraiser. I arrived early, playing the role of the defeated, obedient daughter to absolute perfection. Richard had summoned me to this closing meeting late Thursday evening. He claimed my presence was required to receive a minor administrative stipend for handling the hospital paperwork. I knew the true reason. Richard spent his 20s failing at high-stakes commercial real estate ventures before retreating into a mediocre corporate management career. This multi-million-dollar land sale represented his desperate final grasp at validation. He wanted to feel like a titan of industry. More importantly, he needed an audience. He wanted to force me to sit in a leather chair and watch him trade our family legacy for a wire transfer. He wanted to witness the exact moment my eviction became a legal reality. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom. Richard and Trent were already seated at the long mahogany table. They looked like men who had just conquered a small country. My father wore a bespoke silver suit, his posture radiating a slick, unearned confidence. Trent sat beside him, tapping his fingers against the polished wood, his eyes reflecting the eager greed of a man anticipating an unearned fortune. Across the table sat Mr. Caldwell, the lead acquisition director for the development firm. Caldwell was a predator in a tailored pinstripe suit, a man whose entire career consisted of paving over fertile Midwestern soil to construct concrete distribution hubs. He flanked himself with two junior attorneys, both busy arranging stacks of thick legal folios. "Fiona," Richard said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. He did not stand to greet me. He gestured vaguely to a chair positioned in the far corner away from the center of the negotiations. "Take a seat. We are just about to finalize the transfer documentation. Try to keep quiet while the adults handle the heavy lifting." I offered a tight, subservient nod. I walked to the corner chair and sat down, placing my modest leather portfolio on my lap. I crossed my ankles and folded my hands, projecting an aura of total surrender. Caldwell smiled, a sharp expression devoid of any genuine warmth. He opened the primary folio and smoothed the heavy parchment paper flat against the mahogany table. "Gentlemen," Caldwell began, retrieving a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. "The funds are currently staged in our corporate escrow account. We have verified the agreed-upon purchase price for the 400 acres along with the secondary site preparation disbursement. That secondary fee will be routed directly to Golden Yield Consulting LLC per your specific instructions." My pulse maintained a slow, steady rhythm. I sat in the corner and listened to the acquisition director confirm the mechanics of the crime. The developer was initiating two separate wire transfers. One routing number pointed to the official estate holding account. The second routing number directed the lucrative illicit kickback straight into my father's private shell company. "The routing numbers are verified," Richard stated, leaning forward to inspect the documents. "We are ready to proceed with the execution." "Excellent," Caldwell replied. He slid the first stack of paper across the table. "Before we initiate the federal wire transfer, we require the standard seller affidavits. This is the affidavit of title. By signing this document, you are swearing under penalty of perjury that you are the sole and rightful owners of the property, that the title is free and clear of any encumbrances, and that no other entity holds a claim to the acreage." I watched my father reach for the gold fountain pen. The legal weight of the document resting under his hand was staggering. The affidavit of title is the bedrock of commercial real estate. Signing it with false pretenses transforms a simple local forgery into a devastating federal offense. Richard was about to swear on the official record that he possessed the right to sell the Fletcher farm. I knew the truth. I knew the irrevocable blind trust held the true deed. I knew Vincent Mitchell sat in his downtown office holding the genuine title. The farm had not belonged to Silas Fletcher for 5 years, and it certainly did not belong to the arrogant man holding the gold pen. Richard did not hesitate. He did not pause to read the fine print. He uncapped the fountain pen and pressed the nib against the signature line. He scrawled his name with a bold, sweeping flourish. He slid the document to his right. Trent eagerly grabbed the pen and scribbled his own signature beneath our father's name. The trap clicked shut. The crime was no longer a theoretical plan discussed in a hospital cafeteria. It was an executed, documented reality. By signing those affidavits to facilitate an electronic transfer of funds across state lines, Richard and Trent committed federal wire fraud. I sat in my corner chair, my face a mask of quiet resignation, internally cataloging the precise moment my family handed the federal government the rope for their own execution. Caldwell collected the signed affidavits and handed them to his junior attorneys. He tapped a few keys on his sleek silver laptop, authorizing the release of the funds from the corporate escrow. "The wires are initiated," Caldwell announced, closing his laptop. "The banking network will process the transfer over the weekend. The title company will record the deed with the county clerk on Monday morning. Congratulations, gentlemen. The property is officially ours." Trent let out a loud, unprofessional whoop of excitement. He clapped Richard on the shoulder. My father leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and exhaled a long breath of profound satisfaction. An executive assistant entered the boardroom carrying a silver tray lined with crystal flutes and a chilled bottle of vintage champagne. She poured the sparkling wine, the bubbles rising in the pristine glass. Caldwell handed a flute to Richard and another to Trent. The assistant approached my corner and offered me a glass. I shook my head, requesting a simple glass of sparkling water instead. Richard stood up, raising his crystal flute toward the center of the room. He looked directly at me, his eyes shining with vindictive triumph. "To progress," Richard declared, his voice dripping with condescension. "To moving out of the dirt and into the future. And a special toast to Fiona. Thank you for handling the tedious hospital chores while we managed the real business. I hope you have started packing up the cottage. The bulldozers arrive on Wednesday." Trent snickered, raising his glass in a mocking salute. They expected me to lower my head in shame. They wanted to see the tears form in my eyes. They needed to taste my defeat to make their victory complete. I stood up slowly, holding my glass of sparkling water. I met my father's gaze. I did not glare. I did not frown. I offered him a calm, pleasant smile that caused a brief flicker of confusion to cross his features. "To the future," I replied softly, raising my water glass. I took a slow sip. The carbonation burned pleasantly against my throat. I sat back down and watched them drink their expensive champagne, celebrating a transaction that was destined to fail. The timeline was already ticking in my head. The developer initiated the wire transfer. The funds were now trapped in the digital transit system. On Monday morning, the title company would attempt to file the forged deed with the county clerk. The automated municipal system would immediately flag the blind trust block. The corporate escrow account would freeze instantly. The developers would realize they had transferred millions of dollars for a fraudulent title. I sat in the corner of the sleek corporate boardroom, surrounded by glass and steel, and savored the profound, dramatic irony. My father and my brother were toasting to their own wealth, entirely unaware that the champagne in their glasses was celebrating their impending prison sentences. I finished my sparkling water in silence, ready for the storm that Monday morning would inevitably bring. Monday morning arrived with a bitter chill that froze the dew on the remaining cornstalks. I sat at the drafting table in my caretaker cottage, a mug of black coffee resting beside my laptop. The eviction notice my father handed me days prior lay tucked inside a desk drawer. The 30-day deadline he imposed meant nothing now. The timeline that mattered was ticking down on my glowing computer screen. In the agricultural appraisal industry, the county clerk operates as the supreme authority. Deeds, liens, and property transfers run through a municipal database that serves as the indisputable record of ownership. The doors to the records office opened at 8 o'clock in the morning. I knew the developer's title agency would be waiting in the lobby. Corporate logistics firms do not leave multi-million-dollar assets unrecorded for long. They needed the stamped filing to finalize the escrow release and take physical possession of the land. I logged into the public portal, navigating to the parcel identification number assigned to our family farm. My cursor hovered over the refresh button. I did not blink. I listened to the wind rattle the window panes of the cottage, feeling a strange kinship with the approaching winter storm. At 9:14, the database refreshed. A new entry populated under the transaction history. The developer's title company had attempted to record the warranty deed bearing my father's forged signature. Below the entry, a bright red rejection code blinked onto the screen. The municipal software hid an impenetrable barrier. The clerk's office flagged a critical title defect. The system registered the existence of the irrevocable blind trust Vincent Mitchell had filed 5 years ago. The digital wall held firm. The corporate developer just discovered they had handed over a fortune for a useless piece of paper. My cell phone buzzed against the wood of my desk. The caller identification displayed Vincent Mitchell. I answered the call, keeping my eyes fixed on the red rejection code. The trap closed. Mitchell stated, his voice devoid of any morning pleasantries. Caldwell's legal team attempted to file the transfer. The clerk rejected the deed. The developer realized the title is encumbered by a senior trust. Did the funds clear the reserve window? I asked, needing to confirm the financial mechanics. No, Mitchell replied. Corporate escrow systems are heavily monitored for this exact scenario. The moment the title rejection registered, the developer's compliance software triggered an automatic freeze. The wire transfers were clawed back from the transit network. Your father and your brother never received a single cent. Their accounts are empty. A profound sense of relief washed over my shoulders. My grandfather's legacy remained untouched. The dirt beneath my boots still belonged to the Fletcher bloodline. Caldwell is not a man who accepts humiliation gracefully. Mitchell continued, the satisfaction evident in his crisp pronunciation. His firm just wasted weeks of payroll, legal resources, and corporate maneuvering on a fraudulent transaction. They filed an emergency injunction an hour ago. The district judge signed it immediately. Subpoenas, I asked. Served 20 minutes ago, Mitchell confirmed. Process servers delivered the documents directly to their front doors. Richard and Trent are being summoned for an emergency fraud hearing at the county courthouse on Wednesday. Caldwell is pursuing civil damages, and the judge has already referred the forged affidavits to the prosecutor's office for review. The walls are caving in on them, Fiona. Thank you, Vincent, I said. I will see you at the courthouse. I ended the call and set the phone down. The quiet of the cottage felt different now. It was no longer the silence of a condemned building. It was the calm epicenter of a hurricane I had orchestrated. I walked into the kitchen to rinse my coffee mug. The water was still running when my phone began to vibrate across the desk. The sharp, frantic rhythm of the ringtone echoed through the small house. I turned off the faucet and walked back into the office. The screen displayed my father's name. I let it ring 5 times, allowing his panic to fester. When I finally swiped the screen to accept the call, I did not offer a greeting. I just listened. Fiona, Richard shouted. His voice was a ragged, chaotic mess, entirely stripped of the polished arrogance he had paraded around the boardroom on Friday. Where are you? I need you to get to the county clerk's office right now. I am at home, Dad, I replied, my tone maintaining a cool, unbothered equilibrium. Well, get in your truck, he demanded, his breathing shallow and rapid. There is a clerical error, a catastrophic filing glitch. The developer tried to record the deed and some outdated probate hold flagged the system. Caldwell's people are threatening to sue me. They froze the payout. They sent a process server to my house. A man knocked on my door and handed me a subpoena, Fiona. The terror in his voice was palpable. Richard had spent his entire life avoiding consequences, hiding behind empty suits and loud demands. Now the full weight of the American legal system was sitting on his front porch. I do not understand, I said softly, playing my role for a few seconds longer. The affidavits were signed on Friday. It is Silas! Richard barked, his panic morphing into desperate rage. He must have filed some obsolete agricultural lien years ago and forgot to update the registry. The old fool ruined the closing from his hospital bed. You need to fix this. You know how these municipal databases work. Go down there, show them your proxy paperwork, and authorize the release of the title. Explain that it is an administrative mistake. How was drowning. He was flailing in deep water, reaching out to grab the one person he thought he could command. He delusionally believed the woman he tried to evict would serve as his personal shield. He still viewed me as the obedient secretary, the disposable daughter who existed solely to clean up his messes. I stood in the center of my office, looking at the framed soil map on the wall. I thought about the vintage tractors my brother sold for scrap. I thought about the forged signature on the fake contract. I thought about the smirk on my father's face when he toasted to my eviction with a glass of expensive champagne. The time for playing the submissive victim had officially expired. Dad, I said, letting the silence hang until he stopped his frantic breathing to listen. What? He snapped. Are you getting in the truck? I lowered my voice, infusing every syllable with a cold, devastating finality. I am not going to this clerk's office, I told him. I am not fixing your clerical error. The title is not flagged by an obsolete lien. It is flagged by an irrevocable blind trust. The line went dead quiet. I could almost hear the gears grinding to a halt inside his head as the vocabulary registered. What are you talking about? Richard whispered. The anger drained away, leaving only raw, unfiltered dread. Silas does not own the farm, I stated, delivering the truth like a physical blow. He transferred the deed 5 years ago. You forged a signature on a contract that has no legal standing. You signed a federal affidavit swearing you owned land that belongs to a trust. And the sole beneficiary of that trust is me, Fiona. Richard gasped the reality of his situation crashing down upon him. He realized he was not fighting a bureaucratic glitch. He was fighting me. Fiona, listen to me. We can sort this out. We can come to an arrangement. I was begging. The polished corporate manager was reduced to pleading with the daughter he had discarded. There are no arrangements left to make, I replied. Please, Richard said, his voice cracking. They are threatening me with federal charges. You have to help me. I looked out the window toward the empty machine sheds, feeling the warm, undeniable satisfaction of a harvest coming to fruition. I dropped the subservient mask forever. I'll see you in court, Dad. I pressed the red button on the screen and disconnected the call. I powered the device down, tossing it onto the desk. The psychological shift was complete. I walked to the closet, pulled out my heavy winter coat, and grabbed my truck keys. I needed to drive to the hospital. My grandfather was waiting in the intensive care unit, and it was time to tell him the trap had finally snapped shut. The Polk County Courthouse loomed against the gray Wednesday morning sky like a fortress of limestone and civic duty. Inside, the heavy oak paneling of courtroom 4B smelled of floor wax, old paper, and generations of desperate anxiety. The vaulted ceiling trapped every sound, amplifying the frantic murmurs echoing across the wooden pews. I sat at the plaintiff table, resting my hands on the smooth, polished surface of the desk. Vincent Mitchell sat to my right, unsnapping the brass locks of his battered leather briefcase with practiced efficiency. We were in an island of calm in a room rapidly filling with panic. The heavy double doors at the back of the gallery swung open. Richard marched down the center aisle, followed closely by Diane and Trent. My father wore the same bespoke silver suit he had paraded around the corporate boardroom on Friday, but the garment no longer projected effortless authority. The fabric looked rumpled across his shoulders. His pristine posture had collapsed into a rigid defensive slouch. Diane trailed behind him, her silk scarf pulled tight against her throat. She clutched a designer handbag like a shield, her eyes darting nervously around the imposing judicial environment. Trent walked in last, his previous arrogant swagger replaced by the jittery, erratic shuffle of a man facing the true consequences of his own greed. They did not come alone. Richard had emptied whatever remained of his liquid credit to hire a team of 3 high-priced defense attorneys. The lawyers wore immaculate pinstripes and carried thick digital tablets projecting a false sense of control as they clustered around the defense table. They immediately collided with the opposition. Mr. Caldwell, the lead acquisition director for the development firm, stood near the gallery railing with his own formidable legal counsel. The logistics firm possessed vast corporate resources and zero tolerance for public humiliation. They had spent weeks negotiating a purchase, staging escrow funds, and scheduling demolition crews, only to discover they were victims of a clumsy, arrogant fraud. Caldwell's lead attorney, a tall woman with a voice like sharpened steel, cornered Richard's primary defense lawyer before they even reached their seats. "You presented fraudulent federal affidavits," the developer's counsel stated, her tone echoing sharply off the oak walls. "Your clients signed sworn documents attesting to a clear title they did not hold. That is wire fraud. My client expects full restitution for the legal fees and the immediate return of the staging capital, or we are handing this entire file directly to the federal prosecutor before noon." Richard's attorney, a man visibly sweating above his expensive silk collar, raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture. "My client operated under a good faith misunderstanding of his father's estate planning," the defense lawyer pleaded, lowering his volume in a desperate attempt to contain the argument. The transfer of the deed into a blind trust was hidden from the immediate family. It was a tragic administrative oversight. There was no intent to defraud your holding company. We can settle the damages civilly without involving the federal authorities. The developer's counsel scoffed, crossing her arms. "You cannot accidentally forge a signature on a binding contract. We are not settling this quietly." I sat at my table listening to the legal skirmish unfold. I opened my leather portfolio and arranged my black gel pens in a perfectly straight line next to my legal pad. I retrieved the photocopied forged contract and the carbon receipts from the tractor auction, aligning the edges of the paper with the corner of the desk. Richard had always believed problems could be solved by throwing money at the opposition or yelling until the other side surrendered out of exhaustion. When his first major real estate venture collapsed during my freshman year of college, He blamed the independent contractors, sued the material suppliers, and walked away unscathed while small business owners went into bankruptcy. He expected the exact same outcome today. He assumed this courtroom was just another high-stakes negotiation table. He believed his expensive lawyers could spin his felony into a simple inheritance dispute. Richard noticed my pristine composure. He broke away from the shouting match near the gallery railing and marched purposefully toward the plaintiff table. He leaned over the wooden barrier separating the gallery from the counsel area, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the railing. "Fiona," he whispered, the frantic, desperate edge bleeding into his tone. "This has gone far enough. You have made your point. You proved you are smarter than Trent. Now we need to fix this." I did not look up from my desk. I adjusted the alignment of my legal pad by a fraction of an inch. I spoke with the senior partners at my firm. Richard continued leaning closer, lowering his voice so Caldwell could not hear the desperation. "I can secure a personal loan against my future earnings. I will write you a check for $50,000 today. Cash. You just need to sign a waiver releasing your proxy rights and dissolving this ridiculous trust trick Silas pulled. We can tell the judge it was all a tragic family miscommunication. You get a nice payout, and I keep my deal with the developer. How was offering me a fraction of a bribe from money he did not even possess. He wanted me to trade my grandfather's legacy for a pathetic payoff. I picked up my pen. I clicked the top. The sharp metallic sound cut through his pathetic bargaining. I wrote the date at the top of the blank page. I did not acknowledge his existence. I treated him like an empty space in the room. "Do you hear me?" Richard hissed, his face flushing an ugly mottled red. The veins in his neck stood out against his collar. "I am trying to save this family from financial ruin. If you let Caldwell proceed with this fraud narrative, they will ruin me. Trent will go to federal prison. Is that what you want? Do you want to destroy your own brother over a patch of dirt?" I finally raised my eyes to meet his gaze. I looked at the man who had handed me an eviction notice with a triumphant smile just days prior. "You destroyed yourselves," I said, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. "I just took notes." Richard recoiled as if he had been physically struck. He stared at me, his breathing shallow and rapid. He opened his mouth to deliver another threat, but his lead attorney grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back toward the defense table. The tension in the room thickened, pressing down on the chests of everyone present. Diane sat stiffly in the front row of the gallery, pulling a tissue from her handbag and dabbing her dry eyes for the benefit of anyone watching. She had spent her entire marriage curating an image of effortless suburban wealth, hosting charity luncheons and neighborhood associations, while ignoring the mounting debts Richard accumulated. Now that carefully constructed facade was crumbling in a public courthouse, and she had no idea how to navigate a room where her social status offered zero protection. Trent paced the aisle near the back benches, gnawing on his thumbnail, his eyes darting toward the exit. He had dropped out of community college to pursue quick money schemes, always relying on Richard to bail him out when the ventures inevitably collapsed. This time, there was no safety net waiting to catch him. Richard took his seat beside his legal team. He glared at me across the aisle. He still believed he was fighting a paperwork dispute against a stubborn daughter. He believed his primary adversary was the woman sitting quietly with a notepad. He thought the worst thing that could possibly happen today was losing the developer's payout and facing a steep civil fine. The developer's lawyers took their seats at the opposing table, opening their laptops with sharp, decisive movements. The courtroom fell into a tense, expectant hush. The murmurs died down. The air felt heavy, charged with the static electricity of an impending storm. Vincent Mitchell leaned over to me. He checked his silver wristwatch, a faint predatory smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Right on time," Mitchell murmured. The side door near the judge's bench remained closed, but the heavy oak double doors at the back of the courtroom were about to become the center of the universe. The family sat in their expensive suits, preparing to argue over the intentions of a dying man. They had no idea what was waiting on the other side of the hallway. They were bracing for a legal debate. We were preparing an ambush. Vincent Mitchell checked his silver wristwatch, snapping the brass locks of his battered leather briefcase shut. He stood up from the plaintiff table, buttoning the center button of his charcoal suit jacket. He did not exchange a single word with the defense counsel or the corporate legal team pacing near the gallery railing. He simply turned and walked down the center aisle toward the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom, leaving me alone at the desk. Richard watched him walk away, a smug, misplaced smirk forming on his lips. My father assumed my attorney was retreating to the hallway to make a desperate phone call or negotiate a last-minute plea deal. Richard took a long sip from a ceramic coffee mug he had smuggled in from the courthouse cafeteria, basking in his perceived victory. The wooden side door adjacent to the judicial bench swung open. The bailiff, a stern woman with a silver badge pinned to her uniform, stepped into the courtroom. "All rise," she projected, her voice commanding immediate compliance. The gallery scrambled to their feet. The rustle of expensive wool suits, the squeak of leather shoes, and the clatter of briefcases echoed across the vaulted ceiling. Judge Arthur Lawson took the bench. Lawson was a formidable fixture in Polk County, a jurist who grew up on a working dairy farm before attending law school. He understood the sanctity of property lines, the brutal economics of modern agriculture, and the bitter reality of familial greed. He had spent 2 decades presiding over probate nightmares and commercial disputes, earning a reputation for having zero tolerance for elder exploitation. He sat down, adjusting his reading glasses, and prepared to call the emergency injunction hearing to order. Before the bailiff could announce the docket number, the rear double doors groaned on their brass hinges. The sound pulled every eye in the room away from the judge. Vincent Mitchell pushed a hospital-grade wheelchair through the threshold. Sitting in the chair was Silas Fletcher. My grandfather did not wear a sterile hospital gown or the casual flannel shirts he preferred for working the fields. He wore his Sunday suit, a tailored wool garment he purchased 30 years ago for my grandmother's funeral. The dark fabric held the faint, enduring scent of cedar and mothballs. He wore a crisp white shirt buttoned to the collar and a muted silver tie. The right side of his face still bore the subtle, lingering droop from the cerebral hemorrhage, and a clear plastic oxygen tube rested discreetly beneath his nose, trailing down to a small portable tank attached to the chair. His physical frame appeared frail, hollowed out by days of intravenous fluids and induced sleep. Yet the energy radiating from his rigid posture filled the entire courtroom. His pale blue eyes were sharp, lucid, and fixed with unwavering intent on the defense table. He was the living, breathing embodiment of the Iowa soil, arriving in person to reclaim his stolen legacy. The silence that fell over courtroom 4B was profound. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the suffocating, electrified vacuum that occurs a fraction of a second before a lightning strike. Richard stood near the defense table, his fingers wrapped loosely around the handle of his ceramic mug. He stared at the wheelchair, his mind actively refusing to process the visual information. He had built his entire criminal strategy on the foundational belief that his father was locked in an irreversible terminal sleep. He had celebrated a premature funeral, toasting his own inheritance with expensive champagne. The ceramic mug slipped from Richard's grasp. It hit the polished hardwood floor, shattering into jagged shards. The sharp, explosive crash echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. Dark coffee splattered across the cuffs of his bespoke trousers and pooled on the polished oak planks. Richard did not flinch. He did not look down at the mess. His jaw hung slack, the color draining from his face until his skin matched the pale limestone of the courthouse walls. In the first row of the gallery, Diane pressed both hands over her mouth. Her manicured acrylic nails dug deep into her cheeks. A strangled, panicked gasp escaped her throat, carrying clearly across the dead quiet. She had spent her entire marriage curating an image of effortless suburban wealth, hosting charity luncheons and neighborhood associations, while ignoring the mounting debts and questionable grifts her husband pursued. Now, that carefully constructed social facade was crumbling in a public forum. She shrank back into the wooden pew, trying to fold herself into a smaller shape, desperate to escape the judgment radiating from the man she had encouraged her husband to discard. Trent stumbled backward, losing his footing on the slick floor. His knees hit the wooden barrier separating the gallery from the council tables. He gripped the railing with trembling hands, his knuckles turning white under the strain. The arrogant swagger he carried into the developer's corporate boardroom just days prior evaporated into pure, unfiltered terror. He had dropped out of college to pursue quick money schemes, always relying on Richard to bail him out when the ventures inevitably collapsed. This time, there was no safety net waiting to catch him. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap was not meant for the prey, but for the predator. I remained perfectly seated at the plaintiff table. I did not turn around to watch their reactions. I did not react to the shattered ceramic or the gasps of my relatives. I kept my hands folded neatly on top of my legal pad, my posture impeccable. I watched the developer's high-priced legal team exchange, confused, horrified glances, rapidly realizing they had wired millions of dollars to men who had zero legal authority to sell the dirt beneath their boots. Mitchell navigated the wheelchair down the center aisle, the rubber tires gliding silently over the hardwood. He bypassed the defense table, entirely ignoring Richard's paralyzing shock. Mitchell pushed the chair directly to my side, positioning Silas at the head of the plaintiff table facing the judge. Judge Lawson lowered his reading glasses, peering over the rim at the new arrival. A flicker of recognition crossed the judge's stoic features. He set his pen down on the bench, folding his hands, giving the elderly farmer his undivided attention. The delusions of grandeur my father had cultivated for a lifetime flatlined in real time. The elaborate corporate structure. He built the hidden shell companies. The forged affidavits and the arrogant corporate negotiations all dissolved into ash. He was no longer a savvy real estate mogul orchestrating a complex logistics deal. He was just a terrified son staring at the father he tried to betray for a payout. The developer's lead counsel recovered first, leaning down to whisper fiercely into the ear of her co-counsel. They were rapidly shifting their strategy, recognizing the catastrophic liability they now faced. Caldwell, the acquisition director, stood frozen near the railing, his face a mask of furious realization. He had paved over hundreds of family farms across the Midwest, but he had never been duped by a cheap amateur utilizing a stolen blue pen. The humiliation burned in his eyes as he glared at Richard. Richard finally found his voice. It emerged as a weak, trembling whisper barely audible over the hum of the courtroom ventilation system. "Dad," Richard choked out a solitary word carrying decades of unresolved resentment and sudden, inescapable dread. Silas did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge the man standing in the spilled coffee. He kept his eyes locked on Judge Lawson, holding the full attention of the court, his hands resting firmly on the armrests of the wheelchair. I picked up my black gel pen and uncapped it with a soft click. The sound drew my grandfather's gaze for a fleeting second. Silas offered me a slow, deliberate nod. We were no longer fighting a defensive war from a sterile intensive care unit. We had brought the battle onto our own territory under the glaring lights of the legal system, with the ultimate witness prepared to testify. The stage was set, the audience was trapped, and the true owner of the Fletcher farm was ready to speak. Judge Arthur Lawson leaned forward over the elevated mahogany bench. His stern gaze focused entirely on the elderly man sitting in the hospital wheelchair. The judge bypassed the standard preliminary motions typically reserved for civil injunction hearings. He instructed the court clerk to approach the plaintiff table. The clerk walked across the polished hardwood floor holding a worn leather Bible. Silas raised his functioning left hand, placing his calloused palm flat against the cover. He swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Vincent Mitchell stood beside the wheelchair, adjusting his suit jacket. He guided Silas through the initial establishing questions with methodical precision. Silas stated his full name, his date of birth, and his legal status as the original grantor of the irrevocable blind trust. Every word echoed against the limestone walls, dismantling the opposing defense strategy syllable by syllable. "Mr. Fletcher," Mitchell said, pacing slowly toward the center of the room. He handed a document to the bailiff, who transferred it to Silas. "Can you identify the signature on the commercial sales contract presented to the developer?" Silas looked at the paper, then turned his head toward the defense table. His pale blue eyes locked onto Richard. "That is a forgery," Silas answered. The dry, raspy texture of his voice carried a terrifying authority. "I threw every blue ink pen out of my house a month before my stroke because they leaked on my hands. I did not sign that paper. My son forged my name on a Tuesday when I was heavily sedated with prescribed muscle relaxants. I was asleep in my recliner. I could barely hold a glass of water, let alone negotiate a commercial real estate transaction. The lead defense attorney jumped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. He objected, citing a lack of medical competence and unverified assumptions regarding the timeline. Judge Lawson glared down from the bench, slamming his wooden gavel once. He overruled the objection with swift disdain, noting the detailed neurological clearance forms Mitchell had already submitted into evidence prior to the hearing. Mitchell returned to his line of questioning. He asked Silas to recount his experience in the intensive care unit. Silas gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. He described the terrifying weight of the coma. He detailed the suffocating paralysis, the inability to open his eyes or move his limbs while his auditory senses remained perfectly intact. The courtroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence as the elderly farmer explained how he lay trapped in a hospital bed, forced to listen to his own blood relatives dissect his legacy. I heard them plotting beside my bed. Silas testified, his gaze shifting to Trent. I heard my grandson brag about liquidating my vintage John Deere tractors. I heard my son discuss routing a secondary site preparation fee into a private shell company called Golden Yield Consulting. They carved up my soil to collect a dirty kickback. Then they walked down to the caretaker cottage and handed my granddaughter an eviction notice, throwing her out of her own home to build an asphalt access road. The revelations struck the room like a physical blow. The developer's lead counsel turned to glare at Richard, her expression twisting into pure disgust. Caldwell, the acquisition director, gripped the edge of his table, realizing the profound depth of the deception. Richard had not just forged a deed. He had constructed a premeditated, layered embezzlement scheme at the expense of his incapacitated father, his daughter, and his corporate business partners. Richard slouched in his chair, his hands trembling in his lap. The spilled coffee soaked into his expensive leather shoes. He stared at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the judge, the developers, or his own father. Judge Lawson folded his hands on the bench. He possessed a deep personal understanding of generational farming. He recognized the sacred trust required to maintain Iowa topsoil across multiple decades. The betrayal presented in his courtroom offended his core moral sensibilities. He looked at the forged contract, then at the certified trust documents provided by Mitchell. "This court has heard enough," Judge Lawson announced. His voice resonated with cold judicial finality. "The commercial sales contract is hereby invalidated. The signature is fraudulent. Furthermore, the grantor relinquished personal ownership of the deed to the blind trust 5 years ago. The holding company possesses no legal standing to acquire or sell this land." The judge picked up his pen, signing the injunction order with heavy, deliberate strokes. He looked down at the defense table, his eyes narrowing into a harsh glare. "Mr. Fletcher," Judge Lawson addressed Richard directly, "this court views your actions as a profound violation of both the law and basic human decency. You attempted to liquidate a generational estate while your father lay in a critical care unit. You submitted forged documents to facilitate a federal financial transfer. I am officially referring you and your son to the district attorney." The judge directed his attention to the court reporter, ensuring every word entered the official transcript. "Let the record reflect that this court is forwarding all evidence, including the forged contract, the shell company registration, and the auction receipts, to the prosecutor's office," Judge Lawson dictated. "I am recommending immediate criminal charges for felony elder financial exploitation, forgery, and wire fraud." The defense attorneys sat in stunned silence. They had entered the room expecting to negotiate a civil settlement over a minor clerical dispute. They were now sitting next to clients facing years in a federal penitentiary. The developer's counsel seized the moment. She stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored blazer, and addressed the bench. "Your Honor," the opposing attorney stated, her tone sharp and merciless. "Let the record also reflect that my client is initiating immediate civil litigation against Richard and Trent Fletcher. We are filing for fraudulent misrepresentation and seeking punitive damages. We demand the immediate return of all legal fees, the escrow staging costs, the site survey expenses, and the anticipated revenue losses resulting from this deception." The financial execution was complete. The civil suit guaranteed Richard would spend the rest of his life buried under insurmountable debt. His corporate career was finished. His credit was destroyed. Bankruptcy was no longer a theoretical risk. It was a mathematical certainty. A loud, piercing wail shattered the clinical atmosphere of the courtroom. Diane stood up in this front row of the gallery. Her silk scarf slipped from her shoulders, falling onto the wooden pew. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup. "You cannot do this," Diane cried out, pointing a manicured finger toward the plaintiff table. "We are family. We were just trying to secure our future. We thought you were dying. How can you do this to your own son?" Her outburst echoed off the vaulted ceiling, desperate and pathetic. She appealed to the concept of family loyalty, ignoring the fact that she had urged me to terminate my grandfather's life support just days earlier to expedite her payout. The courtroom offered her no sympathy. The judge glared at her until she collapsed back into the pew, burying her face in her hands. The room remained cold, professional, and unmoved by her performative grief. I sat at the plaintiff table, observing the destruction of my family with clinical detachment. As an agricultural appraiser, I evaluate the worth of ruined structures and depleted fields. Looking at Richard, Trent, and Diane, I recognized an asset that held no remaining value. They had gambled their entire existence on a forged signature and lost everything. The bailiff moved toward the defense table. She instructed Richard and Trent to remain seated while she contacted the district attorney's office to arrange their formal processing. Trent buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Richard stared blankly at the wall, a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had toasted my eviction with expensive champagne. I reached for my legal pad. I placed my black gel pens into their designated slots. I gathered the carbon receipts, the forged contract photocopy, and the shell company filings, sliding them neatly into my leather portfolio. I zipped my briefcase shut. The metallic click sounded crisp and satisfying in the quiet room. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice to mock my father. I simply stood up from the table, adjusted the lapels of my navy blazer, and prepared to wheel my grandfather out of the courthouse. The transition from the clinical sterility of the intensive care unit to the rich, earthy reality of the farm took time. Silas didn't recover overnight. The cerebral hemorrhage left a permanent mark on his physical endurance, demanding a grueling schedule of physical and occupational therapy. We transformed the ground floor bedroom of the main farmhouse into a rehabilitation sanctuary. I packed the contents of the caretaker cottage into cardboard boxes and moved my entire life across the property line. I slept in the upstairs guest room, keeping a baby monitor on my nightstand to listen for his breathing during the long, dark nights. The brutal winter winds howled against the antique window panes, but the interior of the house remained warm, anchored by the steady crackle of the river stone fireplace. Silas approached his recovery with the same stubborn grit he applied to a failed harvest. He fought through the frustration of weakened muscles and slurred speech, performing his daily exercises with a quiet, fierce determination. With my grandfather resting safely under his own roof, I directed my professional focus toward the empty machine sheds. Trent had auctioned off the mechanical soul of our property, but he vastly underestimated the meticulous nature of an agricultural appraiser. I retrieved the yellow carbon receipts from the secure, climate-controlled storage unit. The documents contained the exact serial numbers, buyer registries, and transit logs for every piece of stolen machinery. I spent my evenings sitting at the heavy oak dining table, drinking black coffee and making phone calls to local farmers and regional liquidators across the state. The agricultural community in Iowa relies on a deep, unspoken code of honor. A farmer respects the tools of his neighbor. When I contacted the individuals who purchased our equipment, I explained the circumstances of the auction. I detailed the fraudulent contract, the forged signature, and the pending federal indictments hanging over my father and brother. The response was unanimous and immediate. Not a single buyer contested the return of the equipment. They recognized a fundamental theft and refused to profit from the betrayal of an elder. I authorized electronic payments from the estate account to reimburse their purchase costs, covering the transport fees to bring our property home. 2 weeks before the spring thaw, a commercial flatbed truck backed into our gravel driveway. I stood on the wraparound porch, wrapping a thick wool shawl around my shoulders against the morning chill, and watched the transport crew lower the vintage John Deere tractor back onto our dirt. The faded green paint and scuffed yellow wheels looked like a beacon of restored faith. The engine roared to life, a familiar throaty rumble that vibrated through the floorboards of the porch. A neighboring farmer drove the machine straight into the open bay of the shed, parking it exactly where Silas had kept it for 4 decades. By the end of the month, the combine harvester, the grain augers, and the utility vehicles returned to their rightful places. The farm was whole again. The physical scars inflicted by my brother's greed were erased. The swift, brutal gears of the justice system handled the rest of the family. The federal prosecutor didn't offer any leniency or quiet plea deals. Richard and Trent were formally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, forgery, and elder financial exploitation. The corporate developer pursued their civil litigation with merciless efficiency. Caldwell's legal team secured court orders to liquidate my father's retirement accounts, empty his investment portfolios, and force the sale of his suburban home to cover the staging damages and corporate legal fees. Richard and Trent currently reside in a federal holding facility, awaiting a criminal trial that will inevitably result in lengthy prison sentences. They tried to steal a generational empire, and they walked away with nothing but a concrete cell and a ruined name. Diane didn't stay to watch the collapse of her carefully curated life. Stripped of her social status, her country club memberships, and her financial security, she packed her designer luggage and boarded a flight to stay with a distant cousin on the opposite coast. She left the state in total disgrace, fleeing the judgment of the neighborhood associations she once desperately tried to impress. She didn't call to ask about my grandfather. She didn't ask about my well-being. She simply vanished when the money disappeared. The toxic branches of our family tree were pruned, cut away by the sharp blade of their own arrogance. The removal left the roots of the Fletcher legacy free to draw water and thrive without the burden of their parasitic greed. Spring eventually arrived, softening the frozen earth and preparing the fields for a new planting season. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Silas and I sat together on the wraparound porch. The sun breached the horizon, spilling a vibrant golden light over the endless acres of Iowa cornfields. The morning air smelled of rich, damp topsoil and the promise of a fresh harvest. Silas sat in his favorite wooden rocking chair, a thick woven blanket draped over his knees. His mobility was returning, slow but undeniable. He could hold his coffee mug without his hand trembling. He reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and retrieved a folded manila envelope. He held it out toward me. I set my mug on the small wooden table between us and took the envelope. I opened the flap and withdrew a thick stack of heavy legal parchment. It was a new warranty deed drafted and certified by Vincent Mitchell, recorded officially with the county clerk. Silas had dissolved the blind trust. The document transferred the 400 acres, the farmhouse, the silos, and all associated mineral rights directly into my name. I wasn't just a proxy or a beneficiary waiting in the shadows of a corporate legal structure anymore. I was the legally recognized owner of the Fletcher farm. "You earned it, Fiona," Silas said. His voice retained a gravelly texture, but it carried a profound, peaceful clarity. "You protected the dirt when I couldn't stand up to fight. You saw the truth when everyone else was looking at the money. You are the true guardian of this land." I looked down at the embossed county seal stamped into the bottom corner of the paper. I thought about the sterile intensive care unit, the forged blue ink signature, the arrogant corporate boardroom, and the terrifying silence of the courtroom. I traced my finger over my printed name. Blood establishes a biological relative. It dictates the shape of your jaw and the color of your eyes. It is an accident of genetics. But blood doesn't make a family. Family is built through shared sacrifice, mutual respect, and an unwavering loyalty to the ground beneath your feet. My father and my brother shared my DNA, but they viewed this farm as a disposable commodity. They were strangers who shared a last name. The man sitting next to me in the rocking chair, drinking his coffee and watching the sunrise over the fields, was my true family. I folded the deed and placed it gently on the table. I picked up my ceramic mug, letting the hot liquid warm my palms. A red-tailed hawk circled high above the tree line, riding the morning thermal currents in wide, lazy arcs. The vintage John Deere tractor sat visible through the open doors of the machine shed, resting quietly until the planting season demanded its engine roar to life. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the gentle creak of the wooden floorboards beneath the rockers. There were no corporate developers threatening to pave over the grass. There were no greedy relatives demanding a payout. There were no ticking monitors counting the seconds in a clinical room. The war was over. The land was safe. The story ended in a perfect, peaceful silence.
We spend so much of our lives chasing the American dream, measuring our success by the weight of our keychains and the ink on our property deeds. We work late, we sacrifice our weekends, and we pour our sweat into the soil and the stock market, all driven by a singular, desperate hope to leave our children a better life than the one we inherited. We build trusts, we pay off mortgages, and we meticulously draft our wills, believing that a massive financial inheritance is the ultimate shield against the harshness of the world. But as we have seen through the wreckage of the families we've explored, through the chilling betrayals of figures like Richard Trent and Victoria, we are forced to confront a devastating truth. When material wealth is handed down, without the rigorous cultivation of the soul, it ceases to be a shield. It becomes a poison. Modern society, particularly within the fast-paced, success-driven culture of America, heavily glorifies individualism and material triumph. It is incredibly easy for parents to get swept up in the pursuit of the tangible, forgetting that the most vital things we leave behind cannot be stored in a bank vault. When we measure the value of our family by the size of our estate, rather than the depth of our character, we inadvertently plant the seeds of our own destruction. We raise children who are fluent in greed but illiterate in empathy, children whose narcissism blinds them to basic human decency. If we step back and look at these tragedies through a lens of spiritual reflection and emotional awareness, a profound lesson emerges. The chaos that erupts between siblings fighting over an inheritance does not begin at the reading of a will. It begins decades earlier in the living rooms and kitchens of our homes, rooted in the uncultivated inner lives of the parents themselves. If we truly want to raise children who will thrive, we cannot rely on empty lectures. We must look inward. We must recognize that parents are the roots and children are simply the fruit. To raise a family grounded in honesty, fairness, and genuine love, a parent must actively cultivate 3 core pillars within themselves: wisdom, morality, and willpower. The first pillar is the wisdom to love correctly, which requires profound emotional awareness. Love without wisdom often masquerades as enabling. In traditional family structures, we frequently see the tragic dynamic of the golden child and the scapegoat. Parents driven by their own unresolved traumas or blind spots might shower one child with unearned privileges while turning the other into a repository for the family's burdens. This lack of fairness is an act of deep ignorance. True parental wisdom is recognizing that favoritism is a knife that severs the bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood long before the parents are even gone. Furthermore, wisdom requires us to see through the illusion of permanence. Houses will eventually change hands, land will be sold, bank accounts will fluctuate. A wise parent does not teach a child to sit with an open palm waiting for a trust fund. A wise parent teaches their child how to stand firmly on their own 2 feet, equipped to navigate the world regardless of what is in their wallet. The second pillar is morality, which demands leading by example through honesty and unconditional love. It is not enough to simply tell our children to be good people. We must embody the integrity we wish to see in them. Morality in parenting means offering a love that is entirely devoid of manipulation. It means refusing to use the concept of family duty as a weapon to force one sibling to sacrifice their happiness for another's mistakes. Children are immaculate mirrors. They watch how we speak to our neighbors, how we handle our taxes, and how we treat those who can do nothing for us. If a family lacks a foundation of genuine lived morality, it will inevitably collapse the moment a financial incentive is introduced. You cannot teach a child not to steal if you have spent your life quietly taking advantage of others. The final pillar is willpower, the raw, agonizing courage it takes to set absolute boundaries. Perhaps the hardest task of parenting in our modern era is finding the strength to look at the child you brought into this world and say, no. It requires a Herculean level of fortitude to allow your child to stumble, to fall, and to face the harsh, unyielding consequences of their own actions. Think of Silas, a grandfather who had to summon the unimaginable grit to step back and let his own son walk into a federal courtroom to face the law. It is terrifying to stop enabling the people we love. It is painful to look in the mirror, accept the hard truth that we may have made terrible mistakes in how we raise them and take responsibility instead of hiding behind the fake, polished facade of a perfect family. Ultimately, the greatest inheritance any parent in America or anywhere in the world can leave behind is not a sprawling ranch, a fleet of vintage tractors, or a heavily funded investment portfolio. The true inheritance is self-reliance, self-respect, and the profound capacity for self-healing. When parents do the exhausting, beautiful work of turning inward, when they cultivate their own wisdom, morality, and willpower, that peaceful, grounded energy naturally permeates the walls of their home. It builds a genuine family, one bound together by mutual respect and deep gratitude, rather than a group of strangers, tethered only by a property deed and a shared last name. If you have found a piece of your own story in these reflections, or if you are on a journey to break generational cycles and redefine what family means to you, I invite you to drop a comment below and hit subscribe to Fluffy Revenge. We are building a community of people who are learning to set hard boundaries, protect their peace, and quietly come out ahead. Your support ensures the next story finds its way to you. As you turn off your screen and step back into the quiet reality of your own home, take a moment to look around at the life you are building. Look at the people you love, the expectations you hold, and the silent lessons you are passing down with every passing day. We spend so much time worrying about the harvest we will leave behind, but rarely do we inspect the health of our own roots. When the final season turns and all the gold and concrete have faded into memory, what will truly remain in the soil you leave behind? Which of the three pillars, wisdom, morality, or willpower, do you find is the most difficult to actively practice in your own daily life?